Hello, Guidely community and friends and guides and team members. This is our first featured speaker and workshop under this community. And we've done it in different platforms before, and we're very excited to be here. So I'll say just a few words about Guidely before we start. But first, I'll introduce Shannon, my partner and co-founder here at Guidely. My name is Amir Glogau. And Guidely is the home for people who are...
Only 80 people are on.
Please mute if you're just coming in. Now you should be coming in muted, but just take a minute to make sure everyone's mics are muted. Thank you.
So we're a platform and a community for people as they grow and develop in their life. We feature 100 guides from 17 countries, and we have weekly, quarterly, actually more than once a week, we have different groups in the community that you're more than welcome. If you're here, you're already part of the community, so you're welcome to participate. And I think without further ado, why don't you introduce us, Gabor, for today's workshop.
We are so excited and honored and have been looking forward to this day for quite some time. We have with us Gabor Maté, who is a retired physician who, after 20 years of family practice and palliative care experience, worked for over a decade in Vancouver's downtown east side with patients challenged by drug addiction and mental illness. The best-selling author of 4 books published in 27 languages, Gabor is an internationally renowned speaker, highly sought after for his expertise on addiction, trauma, childhood development, and the relationship of stress and illness. His book on addiction received the Hubert Evans Prize for Literary Nonfiction. And we recently watched The Wisdom of Trauma, and it really had me reflecting deeply on how I was parented and raised and how I'm raising my own daughters. And I'm just really honored and excited. Thank you, Gabor.
Thank you for inviting me, Amir and Shannon and the whole group. I've been asked to speak about compassionate inquiry, which is it's a therapeutic modality that I can't say I give, because that would be putting too much credit into my corner. What actually happened was that working as a physician, I found that virtually every chronic issue that I was confronted by in my patients, whether it's what we call mental illness, and when I say what we call, I use that advisedly, and chronic physical illness, that virtually everything, not everything, but virtually everything was related to childhood trauma, both in what we call the physical realm and the mental realm. Not that the two can be separated. So if that's the case, for example, if let's take multiple sclerosis, somebody with multiple sclerosis, or any other chronic condition, or depression or anxiety, ADHD, whatever. If what I was perceiving that it all has a traumatic template, then it's clearly not sufficient, as Western medicine does, to deal simply with the disease itself, which is simply a symptom of something deeper. But you'd also have to look at those deeper dynamics that are driving the identified disease. So people needed counseling, they needed to be asked questions, they needed to be listened to. Now, because there's very little in the medical system that provides that, I mean, the only people that are paid to listen to people are psychiatrists. But in my experience, at least here in Vancouver, most psychiatrists are not prepared to do that. They don't know how to do it. They don't get trained how to do it. What they get trained to do is to make a diagnosis like depression, make the assumption that this condition is based on some biological problem with the brain, and then to medicate it, which sometimes can help, and it's helped me personally. But whatever it's doing, it's not getting at the roots. So people needed listening to and being asked the right questions. Unfortunately, where I practiced in Vancouver for 22 years as a family practitioner. Uh, my patients could not afford private psychologists who were not covered by the medical plan. So that left me having to put myself into the role of asking questions and listening to people. So I got quite an education. And that began the process of how to ask the right questions and which questions to ask and how to listen. And that eventually people started asking me, well, can you teach us what you do? And I said, I can't teach you what you do because I'm not doing anything. Like I'm just doing what I'm doing, but I don't know what I'm doing. Anyway, to make a long story short, they said, yes, there's something to teach, and eventually evolved this modality, which is now a course for internationally. It's been taken over 2,500 therapists and doctors, so on around the world in over 80 countries in the last 3 years. So that's compassionate inquiry. Now, the essence of it is two assumptions. One is that the truth is actually located inside everyone, that whatever traumas they experienced, the truth, the answer is within themselves, although they're blocked from perceiving it. And by asking the right questions and doing so in a manner that provides safety, in other words, in asking it with compassion, it'll help guide people to their own truth. Now, then for 12 years, I worked in the downtown east side of Vancouver, which is North America's. I also worked in palliative care, working with dying people. And I noticed that both in my family practice and in palliative care unit, the people that ended up with chronic and often terminal illnesses, it wasn't accidental. It was actually rooted in childhood trauma and lifelong emotional patterns that they weren't even aware of. Then I worked in Vancouver's downtown east side, which is North America's heaviest area of drug use. If you've ever been to Vancouver, if you visit the downtown east side, you'll be shocked by what you see in the streets. And in working there for 12 years, I fully got not something which I understood before, but it was inescapable, that addiction itself is a response to trauma. And so the long and the short of it is that no matter what I'm dealing with, so-called mental illness, and I say so-called, or addiction, or chronic physical afflictions like autoimmune disease, malignancy, and so on, is in the preponderant, the majority of cases, rooted in childhood trauma. Now, the upside of this, and I'll talk to you about my view of trauma in a moment, but the upside of this is it also means that we can actually do much better than control people's symptoms. People can actually heal. Now, I'm not promising a panacea or a cure-all, but what I can tell you is I know cases of terminal disease where doctors have said there's nothing more we can do, you're going to die. And people are alive decades later, not because of my work, but because of some transformation inside themselves. This has been documented. There's at least a couple of books by very respected professionals. And I have also documented people with multiple sclerosis who are told you're going to have to be on medication for the rest of their lives. Then they engage in a process of transformation, whether through compassion inquiry or some other modality. And lo and behold, they're off their medications and the disease does not progress. I know many such cases. How is that even possible? Well, if you look at things from the traditional, I should say conventional, Western medical point of view, it's not possible. But the problem is that the conventional medical point of view is hopelessly narrow, and it's hopelessly behind the science, because the science shows that mind and body can't be separated, that the emotional system in our brains and our bodies is part and parcel of the same apparatus that also governs our hormones, our immune systems, our nervous systems, our hearts, and our guts. In other words, these aren't separate organs and systems, it's all one system. I'm not giving you airy fairy new age ideology here. I'm giving you hard science. And you can ask me about the science if you want, but for now, you just have to take my word that there have just been thousands of scientific studies published in major journals. So that's not even controversial what I'm telling you. But that also means, since it's one system, when you recognize that emotions and repressed emotions or overwhelming emotions played a role in the onset of your condition and keep it going, it only follows that if you learn to cope with those emotions and understand them and get into a different relationship with yourself, why wouldn't the disease also be affected? See, here's the thing about disease, again, what's called mental or physical disease. There's a certain way that we have of talking about it. That certain way of talking about it has an assumption built into it. So compassion inquiry, to some degree, is all about challenging your assumptions, your unconscious assumptions. Let me give you an assumption. You say about somebody, so-and-so has ADHD, so-and-so has depression, so-and-so has multiple sclerosis, so-and-so has ulcerative colitis. Well, there's an assumption in that way of speaking. Now, can anybody here tell me the assumption? It's okay if you put up your hand if you can tell me the assumption. If you can't, that's okay. It took me decades to figure this one out. Yeah, you got a hand up there, John?
Internal.
So John,
I'm sorry.
what's
It's
the,
Susanna is the assumption that it's something like within you, a characteristic, something that like is not separate from your being. If you have this, instead of you are afflicted by it.
well, you're on the right track for sure. Here's the thing. I have a cell phone. I can put it down. I can throw it out the window. I can keep it. But it's the thing that's separate from me. And I have that thing. When we talk about I have depression or I have multiple sclerosis, we're making an assumption that the so-called disease is a thing in itself and that I, as a separate individual, have that thing. But that thing has got a characteristic and a life of its own, regardless of what's happening with me. That's what the assumption is. But what if there's no such thing as disease? What if disease of mind or body or both is a process? And that process manifests something about my life and the way I relate to myself and what happened to me in childhood and what kind of patterns were ingrained in my nervous system when I was even in the womb or since then. What if it's a process that actually manifests my life? Then it follows, if I can live my life differently, perhaps that process will change. In other words, I have agency. I have some say. Well, that itself is a completely different way of looking at it. And that way of looking at it, by the way, is precisely what allows people to overcome or defy all kinds of diagnoses, because the diagnoses assume that the disease has got a life of its own. And I'm sure most of you on this call, if I asked you, last time you went to a physician with anything chronic, did they ask you about childhood trauma? Did they ask you about your relationship to yourself, how you feel about yourself as a human being? Did they ask you about your relationship with your spouse, your partner, your work? Any of that? Probably not. Probably they concentrated on the symptoms. And the disease itself is a symptom. So therefore, and you know, again, with the healing of trauma. So let me talk to you about a little bit about trauma, and then I'll stop for questions because I don't need to hear myself talk much longer. So trauma, I'm saying, is a template for everything, virtually everything. What is trauma now? Now, most of the time we talk about trauma, we're assuming terrible things, a war, and as we all know, the world is often in a place of traumatic tension. If not in Europe, then in the Middle East. If not in the Middle East, then in Africa or anywhere in the world. So war, abuse, sexual abuse, death of parents, major losses. Those are traumatic, but they're not the trauma. And so trauma is not what happens to you. I'll talk about that more in a moment. The word trauma comes from the Greek word for wound or wounding. So trauma is a wound. So in this case, a psychic wound, a psychological wound. Not that you can separate the psychology from the physiology, by the way. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, just imagine yourself in a state of rage or a state of love. And tell me, is your body the same? Clearly not. Different hormones, different neurological discharges, different responses in your viscera, different muscle tension, different heart rate, different breathing, different facial muscles. So you can't separate psychological from physiological. So trauma then is a wound, a psychological wound. But so trauma is not what happens to you. Trauma is what happens inside you as a result of what happens to you. If I cut you with the knife, the trauma is not the knife or the cut. The trauma is the wound that you retain. And you can wound people not just by doing terrible things to them. You can wound people, particularly vulnerable children, in very small ways. You can wound them by doing bad things to them, yes, but you can also wound them by not meeting their needs. Not meeting the needs that nature wired into us. So, what are some basic needs of children? What are some irreducible needs of children? Well, one of them is a secure attachment relationship, when they really are accepted and loved and welcomed to exist. That's a need. When I say need, it's as much as a need as eating and drinking or oxygen. If we're talking about healthy human life, healthy human development. That's the first need. The second need of children is that within that relationship, they should be able to rest. They should not have to work to make that relationship work. They should not have to be good. They should not have to be nice. They should not have to be pretty. They should not have to be successful. They should not have to be compliant. They should not have to look after the emotional needs of the parents. They can rest. In other words, they can be children. The third need of the child is to be able to feel all their emotions, to feel all their emotions. Now, in modern society, a lot of people, parents are taught that when your child is angry, you give them a timeout. In other words, you withdraw the relationship, which is essential for their healthy development. So we use the relationship to threaten the child, basically tell them certain emotions are acceptable, certain emotions are not acceptable. That's a wound to the child. And the fourth need is free play, spontaneous play. Not with these machines. Spontaneous free play that has no agenda. Those needs not being met, children are wounded all the time. By loving parents who only want the best for their kids. And not to mention the fact that, as I did with my children, if we have unresolved traumas that we carry that show up in our parental relationship or in our family life, we're passing our traumas onto our children. So without going to my personal history, I very much got the message as an infant that I wasn't wanted. So I've said this often, if you're not wanted, if you want to be wanted, if you're desperate to be wanted, for God's sakes, go to medical school, because they're going to want you all the time. They're going to want you when they're being born, even before they're born. They're going to want you when they're dying, and at every moment in between that there's a problem. But it's highly addictive because inside you, it's never enough. Because if you don't want yourself, you'll have to keep proving to yourself that you want it. And not only that, if you want it for what you can do, it doesn't satisfy because there's a momentary high from being wanted. But there's a question in your psyche. If I didn't give them what they want, would they still want me? So it's never satisfying. This is true in relationship as well. It might be very satisfying to be sexually wanted temporarily, but it doesn't stay with you. Because what if I wasn't pretty? What if I wasn't handsome? What if I didn't please them sexually? So this external validation and evaluation is always addictive. So there's all kinds of ways to wound people. Now, what is trauma? So trauma then is not what happens to you. Trauma is what happens inside you. And it's a wound. And a wound has two ways to go. And in trauma, they both show up. One of them is the wound is highly sensitive. If I have a wound on my arm here or on my shoulder here, and if I tap it, it's really going to hurt. Even though I only tap myself very lightly, but if there's an open wound there, it's going to be excruciatingly painful. So trauma is a highly sensitive place where if somebody touches on it, you're going to get upset and hurt and pained and angry and so on. And by the way, this is what happens in relationships, is that your partner, friend says something and my God, you have this reaction. That reaction has nothing to do with the present. So one of the things that trauma does is it keeps you from being in the present moment. You keep reliving the past. And you don't even know it. So it's very sensitive trauma. It's an area of pain. That's one aspect of a wound. The other aspect of a wound is a wound scars, scar tissue forms. And what's the nature of scar tissue? It has no feeling in it. It has no nerves in it. So you become numbed to your own experience in many ways. It's rigid. It's not flexible. So your responses become rigid. And it doesn't grow. So when you're traumatized and you're not dealing with it, you're not growing emotionally, psychologically. So that very often you're reacting like a 2-year-old. Trauma keeps us, as I said, from being in the present moment. It can give us a skewed, distorted view of the world. Both directions, by the way. It can give you a view of the world that the world is a horrible place and everybody's against you. And if that's what you believe, you'll be president of the United States, because that's what Donald Trump said in his biography. The world is a horrible place. Even your friends want your wife and your house and your dog, and that's your friends, never mind your enemy. That's the world he lives in. Why? Because what happened to him in childhood. And we know what happened to him. Trauma can also distort your view that everything is lovely and beautiful and la-di-da, in which case you're in denial and you don't see reality. So trauma disconnects you from yourself because, you see, when being yourself really hurts and you have no escape and no help, what can you do but disconnect? And you can disconnect by tuning out or by developing hallucinations or just by not feeling your body. So these are some of the implications of trauma. And I'm saying it's at the basis of virtually every problem that as therapists or as physicians we ever see. And there's a way to get there by asking the right questions in a compassionate way. And it's also a way of teaching people to be compassionate to themselves. So let me stop there and take any questions you might have. Now, Amir and Shannon or whoever, can you guys recognize the speakers so that's not on me to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. We'll pin them. Thank you. That was really, I have lots of questions,
Yeah,
but we'll
well, why
open
don't you
this up.
start?
Where did I
Yeah,
start?
yeah.
So, I have been listening and digesting and learning here alongside all of you. And, my question goes to parenting my own children who are young teenagers. And, we don't know what we don't know until we know better. And so how do you begin to undo some of the trauma or heal the trauma that you've passed on unknowingly?
Okay, so thank you. First of all, with teenagers, there's a dynamic that we really have to watch, which is that who are they attached to, where they're looking to for direction. Because if they're not looking to you for direction, you have a very difficult task. Now, in this society, in traditional societies, that didn't used to be a problem. Children look to adults,
Mm-hmm.
and children would be initiated into the adult world by adults. Now, in our society, that doesn't happen anymore. And there's reasons for that. So I'll give you a brief synopsis here of one of the books that I've written called Hold On to Your Kids. And I mention it again in my new book. There's this attachment drive in children and in parents, by the way. Our brains are wired to attach. There are circuits in our brains that just direct us to attach to other human beings. So attachment is the drive for closeness, proximity with another human being for the purpose of taking care of them or for the purpose of being taken care of. And you can see that without that, we would not survive. There'd be no human life, no bird life without that. So birds, mammals, we have this attachment drive. But there's nothing in our brain that tells us who to attach to. There's nothing in the brain that says attach to mom or dad. There's a good reason for that. Mom and dad might die. And then what happens? So the attachment drive is transferable. Now, in elderly, I should say in traditional cultures, where there was lots of adults and relatives around, children grew up in a context of a community with lots of attachment figures in their life. And you can see this still in many places in the world. Modern society has destroyed that. It has destroyed the community. It has really cut loose the extended family. We're lucky if the nuclear family is still intact. And unlike under evolutionary conditions, which is how we spent millions of our years evolving, we don't spend time with our parents anymore. Kids from a very early age on don't see their parents most of the day. Now take a duck. The duck hatches from the egg, sees the mother duck, and then attaches to the mother duck. The word we use is imprinting. And basically the duckling says to herself, oh, you're my mentor, my nurturer, my protector, my guide. I'm going to follow you until I become a healthy adult. And then bye-bye, Now, what we know is if the mother duck is absent when the duckling hatches, the duckling will attach to anything that moves. And that could be a dog or a toy, neither of which are designed by nature to bring up that duckling to adulthood. The immature brain cannot handle what we call an attachment void, an absence of attachment. So it has to fill it with whoever's around. Now, for our kids, who's around most of the time, most of the day, from an early age on? Other kids. And so our children have become peer attached and peer oriented. And now parents lose all their power. So the first thing you have to ask yourself in response to your question, Shannon, is how much attachment power do I still have?
Mm-hmm.
Or do I have to redeem my children from the peer group?
Mm-hmm.
That's the first thing. The second thing is you can't fix in your children anything you haven't fixed in yourself. So it's a matter of have we dealt with, or are we dealing in an ongoing basis with our own traumas, and are we clearing them up? It's not a question of being perfect, but it's a question of do we understand that, or are we just desperately trying to correct in our kids something that still bothers us about ourselves? That's the second point. The third point is that if we see our children only through the lens of how we traumatize them, we're not doing them any favor, because nobody wants to be seen as somebody else's mistake. And believe me, my kids have taught me a lot about that, you know. So don't see them through the lens of trauma. See them as whole beings, and see the resilience in them. Because I mean, look, I'm assuming from your question, Shannon, that you've had some traumas in your life. I'm assuming that you've dealt with some of those traumas, you've recognized them. And so here you are, despite those traumas, doing fine. So we're not doing our kids very much of a favor if we see them as kind of, oh my God, what did I do to them? You know, these poor people, you know. And so it's a matter of restoring their relationship, not putting pressure on them, offering them the background of a safe relationship, and then letting them take the lead. That's how you help them.
Right.
So,
So powerful.
uh-huh.
Thank you so much.